How cheap is Asia right now?
Yeah, I think one of the good ways that we try to look at this is just running a price to book over Asia over the last sort of 20 years of history. And, we're getting down, not quite at the absolute lows, but down towards those sort of lows we've seen in the sell-offs in 2009, 2000, and even going back to sort of the Asian crisis. So I guess from that perspective, we all know there are quite a few negatives around, but a lot of that is reflected in the valuations that we see in Asia. And that arguably is not the case that we see in other markets, particularly the US. So a lot of negatives are priced in.
Joshua, there were some valuation opportunities across Japan as well, which has for a long time underperformed. But given the recent rally that we've seen in Japanese equities, do we still have room to run?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Japan is not as contrarian as it was at the end of last year, but we think there's a number of aspects to this. I mean, first of all, we have the change in the inflationary outlook. We have the move that we're seeing around the potential exit of yield curve control. But perhaps the most important one is the restructuring element. So I guess for a number of years, everyone has known there's always been, for lack of a better word, trapped value sitting in Japan, whether that's been cross shareholdings, cash sitting on balance sheets, etc. Now, what we've seen due to a number of measures, due to what's been happening with the voting proxy companies, what we've seen from the TSE, is we're starting to see management move to liberate that value. Now, the positive of that is, one, it takes a period of time, but secondly, it's less impacted by the global macro environment. So we're seeing a lot of evidence that is continuing. More and more companies are seeing the success of companies that have done that. So we think that's going to be ongoing. I guess that sort of big jump up in Japan has not quite happened. It's not likely to happen as much going forward, but that stock selection opportunity will be quite significant. I think the other thing to consider from a Japan perspective has also been the yen. Clearly, that's been very weak, as we've seen hiking around the rest of the world. But we may see something that's a little bit more counter trend to other central bank action going forward.
What is the risk premium when it comes to China at the moment? Obviously, you've got some bargain hunters with bigger risk appetites that are probably quite intrigued by valuations right now. Are you in that camp?
Yeah, I think you hear a lot of people that are either, think things are going to turn around very quickly, or people who are very pessimistic. I guess we take more of a middle ground. We think there are a number of challenges. I think they're pretty well known. But what we find interesting is that a number of what we would generally consider high quality companies that have historically been very, very expensive are now looking quite cheap. Now, that's a sort of a precursor to being a good alpha opportunity, but we're also seeing more than that, because despite the weak macro environment, we're seeing some of these companies are starting to beat earnings. So they're cheap, they're good companies, they're starting to beat earnings, and we're seeing some shareholder-friendly policies, whether that's increasing in dividends or buyback activity. So I don't think it's as simple as just making a big call on what may or may not happen on the market, but we do think from that bottom-up stocks perspective, there are opportunities. That being said, China's got very, very cheap. And if we remember back to sort of the end of last year, when people were quite pessimistic around reopening, and then when it happened, we saw an almost 60% rally in the market. So I think you do need to be, a little bit sort of mindful that these type of events can happen, and they do have fiscal room.